When racist woman calls the police on Big Shaq sunbathing, thinking the mansion isn't his, she unleashes more than just flashing lights and suspicion. The story unfolds not in whispered apologies, but in a storm where truth crashes through prejudice and silence shatters into revelation. This isn't just a misunderstanding, it's a reckoning where judgment faces its mirror, and a neighborhood watches as masks fall. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The sun painted long golden strokes across the rolling lawns of the mansion, its rays draping over the sculpted hedges, like velvet. At the heart of this sanctuary, Big Shaq lay on a reclining lounger, his eyes closed, the weight of the world temporarily lifted. The air hummed with the faint buzz of bees weaving between the vibrant petals of a flower bed nearby. His broad frame, a stark contrast to the delicate blooms, radiated a calm that felt both earned and effortless. The mansion behind him, its tall white columns casting grand shadows across the neatly trimmed grounds, was as much a symbol of success as it was a silent testament to the decades of hard work that had brought him here. Shaq's mind drifted, following the slow arc of a hawk overhead. He felt the weight of memories more than the sun's heat, the echoes of his mother Lucille's voice, gentle yet firm, shaping him into the man he had become. Her lessons had taught him humility in the face of wealth, kindness in the face of cruelty, and strength in the face of misunderstanding. Even here in this opulent neighborhood where his mansion sat like a gleaming crown among lesser jewels, he carried her values as armor against the assumptions the world still flung his way. Across the street, a woman named Beverly Cartwright watched from behind her lace-curtained window. The curtains trembled slightly with the shifting breeze, though the movement was not enough to mask the tension behind her gaze. Her posture was rigid, her lips pressed into a tight line as she peered out, fixated on the sight of the large, dark-skinned man reclining in the sun, as though he owned the world. Beverly was a woman of precision, her garden perfectly arranged, her mailbox freshly painted, her front porch free of clutter, and she guarded her street's image with a zeal that verged on paranoia. Inside her mind, whispers of disapproval tangled with deeper fears she barely dared name. Who was he? What was he doing here? She imagined his presence as an encroachment, a shadow on the sanctity of their well-manicured community. He didn't belong, she thought, though the truth was she didn't know his name, hadn't seen him speak to anyone, hadn't even bothered to wave or smile as a neighbor might. Her assumptions filled the gaps her ignorance left open, painting Shaq as an interloper rather than the mansion's owner. Big Shaq remained motionless, his breathing deep and even. He felt the weight of Beverly's stare without looking her way, like a pressure against the side of his neck. He wasn't a stranger to such gazes. He'd felt them his whole life, the unspoken judgments that came with his size, his skin, his silence. It was almost amusing how predictable it all was. Yet today there was a quiet sting beneath the familiarity, perhaps because he'd wanted nothing more than a peaceful afternoon. The sun was warm, the air light, the mansion quiet, but peace was always a fragile thing, easily cracked by someone else's fear. He opened his eyes and studied the sky, tracing the delicate threads of cirrus clouds, with a distant appreciation. The stillness around him felt deceptive, like the pause between breaths before a storm. He could hear the faint strains of a neighbor's wind chimes, the rhythmic ticking of a sprinkler system coming to life across the street, the soft rustle of leaves high in the trees. These were the sounds of suburban tranquility, but beneath them, something coiled tight, a tension not yet spoken aloud, but present nonetheless. Beverly's fingers twitched at the edge of the curtain, her knuckles whitening with the pressure. She imagined scenarios, each more irrational than the last. Should she call someone? Was he dangerous? But there was no overt threat, no overt action, just a man sunbathing in his own yard. Yet her discomfort escalated, born not of any real danger, but from the discomfort of the unknown. She couldn't reconcile the sight of him, so at ease, so comfortable with the assumptions she'd long carried. The stories she'd heard on the news, the warnings she'd internalized from friends, swirled together into a narrative she accepted without question. Shaq sighed softly, feeling the weight of that unseen scrutiny. He thought of his mother again, of her voice telling him, "You can't change what they see, son, but you can always choose what you show them." He chose calm, he chose patience. He chose for this afternoon to let the sun's warmth sink into his skin and remind him that this was his home, his peace, and no amount of judgment could steal it away. The silence thickened, stretching across the street like an invisible rope pulling taut. Beverly's pulse raced faster, her breath shallow, Her mind leapt to conclusions faster than reason could tether them. She imagined thefts, imagined deceit, imagined scandal, though in truth she imagined nothing more sinister than the echo of her own biases. Still, the tension fed itself, growing in the quiet. Shaq remained still, eyes now half-lidded, watching a pair of squirrels chase each other across the lawn. He let his thoughts drift again, back to the lessons his mother had given him: grace under scrutiny, strength in silence. His wealth had never been armor enough to deflect prejudice, but it had given him the space to build a life of his own choosing, where he could be both visible and invisible at once. Here in the sun, he chose to be unbothered, to let the weight of others' fears slip off his broad shoulders. Beverly's discomfort reached a breaking point. She released the curtain and stepped back from the window, her mind swirling with the urgency of imagined threats. She turned toward the phone on her kitchen counter, her hand hovering over the receiver. The quiet of her house pressed in around her, amplifying the rapid beat of her heart. She hesitated, the internal battle between conscience and suspicion warring silently in her mind. Across the street, Big Shaq let his head tilt back, his face upturned toward the golden sky. He closed his eyes once more, surrendering to the warmth of the sun, the rhythmic pulse of his heartbeat, the quiet resolve in his chest. He knew what was coming. He could feel it like a subtle shift in the air, the crackle before the lightning, the intake of breath before the accusation. But he remained still, a mountain of patience in the middle of a storm that had yet to break. The sunlit silence stretched on, a delicate tense thread binding two very different people in a shared moment of unspoken fears and unvoiced understanding. One sat in the sun, determined to claim his peace. The other stood in shadow, gripped by ghosts of her own making. Neither spoke, but the space between them hummed with the weight of everything unsaid. The afternoon sun had dipped slightly, casting longer shadows across the neat lawns and perfectly edged sidewalks of the neighborhood. Inside her home, Beverly Cartwright's hands trembled as she hovered over the phone, her mind tangled with her own racing fears. The image of the large man, lounging so confidently across the street, gnawed at her composure. She had spent the last hour peering through her curtains, her breath catching each time she imagined him looking in her direction, though he never once glanced toward her. In her head, she painted him with all the suspicions she had accumulated over the years. Stories told in whispered warnings at the neighborhood association meetings, cautionary tales passed down from relatives, and the fearful rhetoric she'd absorbed from television and radio. It was almost mechanical the way she reached for the receiver, her fingers finding the familiar grooves of the buttons, dialing 3 numbers with a practiced sort of panic. The dispatcher's calm voice answered, but Beverly's words spilled out hurriedly, a mixture of breathless concern and forced civility. She described the man as suspicious, mentioned his skin color, hinted at potential danger without making any outright accusations. "He's just sitting there," she said, her voice strained, "on the property. I don't think he belongs there." There was a tremble in her voice, a slight quiver that betrayed her deeper fear. Fear not of actual harm, but of her own discomfort at seeing someone she couldn't immediately categorize as safe. Across the street, Big Shaq remained in his reclined position, though the slight furrow in his brow suggested he sensed something shifting in the air. The light breeze that had carried the scent of blooming jasmine now seemed sharper, more intrusive, as though it carried whispers of judgment on its back. Shaq wasn't naive to these moments. He'd experienced them more times than he cared to count. Yet each time it stung anew, the realization that no amount of success, no height of achievement, could completely shield him from the invisible walls others erected around him. As he lay there, his mind drifted to the lessons his mother Lucille had instilled in him. Lessons of patience, of standing tall without confrontation. He thought about the times he'd been stopped in airports, in stores, questioned not because of anything he'd done, but because of assumptions tied to his skin. He thought about the headlines, the stories that didn't always make the news, and the countless moments of quiet indignity he had swallowed in the name of peace. The sound of distant sirens reached his ears, faint at first but growing steadily louder. He sighed, a deep, almost imperceptible exhale that seemed to carry the weight of every unjust moment he'd endured. He could picture Beverly inside her pristine house, clutching the phone, imagining threats that didn't exist. He could imagine her rehearsing her story, preparing to explain how she was just trying to keep the neighborhood safe. It was a script he knew well, a performance he'd seen play out in countless variations. The police car rolled down the street, its lights flashing a soft red and blue glow against the white columns of his mansion. Shaq sat up slowly, stretching his arms above his head, as though shaking off the remnants of a pleasant dream. He stood, his towering frame unfolding with a grace that belied his size, and began walking toward the edge of his property. There was no panic in his movements, no sign of aggression, just a quiet acceptance of the scene unfolding before him. The officer who stepped out of the cruiser was a tall man with a weathered face, his uniform neat, and his posture relaxed. He glanced toward Shaq, a flicker of recognition passing across his features. His lips twitched into a smile, and he approached with a casual gait. "Mr. O'Neal," he said, his voice carrying across the manicured lawn. "Sorry to bother you. We got a call, thought we'd check it out." Shaq nodded, his expression unreadable. "No trouble," he said, his voice low and even. The officer glanced back toward Beverly's house, his gaze lingering for a moment on the drawn curtains. He shook his head slightly, an almost imperceptible gesture that spoke volumes. "You know how it is," he muttered. Shaq gave a slow nod, his eyes steady but distant. "Yeah," he said, the word hanging in the air like a stone dropped into still water. Beverly, still watching from behind her curtains, felt a surge of confusion ripple through her. She had expected a confrontation, imagined the man being led away, questioned, perhaps even arrested. Instead, the officer's demeanor was relaxed, respectful. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she watched the two men exchange a few more quiet words before the officer returned to his cruiser, the flashing lights dimming as he pulled away. Inside her chest, a knot of fear twisted tighter. How could this be? Had she made a mistake? But her mind, desperate to reconcile the scene with her assumptions, clung to the idea that there must be more to the story. Some hidden explanation that justified her call. She pressed her hand against the cool glass of the window, her breath fogging the pain, her thoughts churning with a mixture of guilt and defiance. Shaq remained standing at the edge of his property for a long moment, after the police car disappeared down the street. He looked back at his mansion, its windows reflecting the last golden light of afternoon, and felt a familiar weariness settle over him. It wasn't just about this one incident, it was about the accumulation of moments like these, each one a reminder that no matter how far he had come, there were those who would always see him as a question mark, a threat, a stranger in his own space. He turned and walked back toward his lounger, settling into it with a deliberate calm. His muscles relaxed, but his mind remained sharp, reflecting on the choices he had made. He could have confronted the woman, could have demanded an apology, could have used his influence to shame her, but Lucille's voice echoed in his memory, reminding him that true strength wasn't in retaliation, but in grace. He chose, once again, to let his actions speak louder than his anger. Inside her home, Beverly sat down heavily at her kitchen table, her hands trembling as she replayed the scene in her mind. The sight of the police officer speaking so casually to the man, no, to Shaquille O'Neal, gnawed at her certainty. How could she have not known? How could she have assumed the worst? But the question lingered unspoken, buried beneath layers of pride and fear. Outside, the neighborhood returned to its quiet rhythm. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the lawns, as the day's tension slowly unwound itself into silence once more. But beneath that silence, the memory of the call, the weight of assumptions, and the quiet dignity of a man who refused to be rattled, would linger, shaping the stories whispered behind closed doors, and the lessons yet to be learned. Inside the tidy confines of her home, Beverly Cartwright sat at her kitchen table, the early evening light slanting through the blinds and casting fractured patterns across the worn wood. The air was thick with silence, save for the faint ticking of a ceramic clock on the wall, each second echoing her sense of unease. The phone she'd used to summon the police sat like an accusation beside her elbow, its quiet presence reminding her of the choices she had made just hours ago. But even now, the discomfort she felt wasn't rooted in guilt. It was the product of something deeper, an old resentment that had festered beneath her carefully curated facade for years. Beverly hadn't always been this brittle, this prone to suspicion. Years ago, she had been a woman full of life, involved in community events, laughing at neighborhood picnics, quick to volunteer for charity drives. But the years hadn't been kind. Her husband, Leonard, had been a realtor with charm and ambition, but he'd left her alone in this sprawling house, burdened with debts and whispers of infidelity, long before his sudden death from a heart attack. The community that had once embraced her slowly turned distant, their polite greetings carrying an edge of judgment. She was no longer the smiling neighbor. She was the widow struggling to maintain appearances, her property taxes mounting as the market shifted, and her savings dwindled. That morning, an envelope had arrived by courier. A thick, ominous packet bearing the name of her late husband's former company, containing terms she had feared for months. It detailed an impending foreclosure notice, the culmination of years of unpaid debts and silent struggles. Her heart had clenched as she read the neatly typed lines, her vision blurring with the realization that her sanctuary, her carefully maintained life, was teetering on the edge of collapse. She had placed the envelope on the counter, its presence as heavy as a stone, and gone about her day in a daze, refusing to acknowledge the inevitable. By the time she noticed the man sunbathing across the street, her nerves were already frayed, her thoughts clouded by panic and pride. His presence felt like an intrusion, a challenge to the brittle control she was barely holding on to. It wasn't just his skin color, though that had lit the initial spark of her unease. It was the ease with which he occupied that space, the quiet confidence he exuded. In that moment, he became the embodiment of everything slipping beyond her grasp: stability, ownership, respect. The call to the police hadn't been a reasoned decision. It had been a desperate grasp for control in a life unraveling faster than she could mend. While Beverly sat in her kitchen, paralyzed by the weight of her unraveling world, Big Shaq stood at his window, gazing out at the lengthening shadows falling across his lawn. His mind wasn't on Beverly. It was on his mother, Lucille. He remembered her voice, low and steady, reciting lessons of grace and resilience during long nights, when money was tight and the world seemed unfair. Lucille had taught him that dignity was not about how others saw you but how you carried yourself when no one is watching. Her lessons had carved into him a deep understanding of patience, of choosing compassion over anger, of finding strength in silence. As a child, Shaq had watched his mother face down her own injustices: dismissive landlords, skeptical bank tellers, sideways glances in grocery stores. With a quiet, unshakable dignity, she had always told him, "Let them think what they want, son. You know who you are, and that's all that matters." Those words echoed now, a balm against the sting of the afternoon's events. He thought about how easy it would have been to react, to confront Beverly directly, to unleash his frustration and demand respect. But he knew that wouldn't change her mind. It might even confirm her worst fears. Instead, he chose patience, chose the lesson his mother had drilled into him. People's actions often reflect their own pain and fear, not the truth of who you are. Shaq found a strange solace in that thought, a reminder that his strength wasn't in proving Beverly wrong but in remaining grounded in his own truth. Back in her kitchen, Beverly's hands shook as she reached for the unopened bottle of wine on the counter. The glass trembled slightly as she poured a measure into a delicate stemmed glass, her lips pressing into a thin line as she took a sip. The alcohol warmed her throat, but it didn't ease the gnawing anxiety in her chest. She thought of the envelope again, of the impending loss of her home, of the shame that would ripple through the neighborhood if her secret became known. In her mind, she replayed the moment she saw Shaq in the sun, the split second her fear had overridden reason. She saw his calm, his lack of aggression, and felt a flicker of doubt, a whisper of regret. But pride was a stubborn companion. Beverly told herself she was protecting the neighborhood, preserving its character, though the words rang hollow in the quiet kitchen. The truth gnawed at her, unspoken, but undeniable. She had reacted not to a threat, but to her own unraveling world, her own fears. Her call to the police had been as much about asserting her presence as it was about removing his. Outside, Shaq watched the sky deepen into hues of violet and gold, the first stars beginning to prick the darkening canvas. He imagined his mother standing beside him, her arms crossed, her head tilted with that familiar mix of exasperation and love. He could almost hear her saying, "It's not about them, son. It's about who you choose to be, even when they don't see you right." The weight of that truth settled over him like a mantle, steadying him against the subtle tremors of anger that threatened to rise. He knew Beverly's story wasn't his to fix, but her fears didn't have to become his burden. He would extend grace, not because she deserved it, but because he deserved the peace it would bring him. As the evening deepened into full twilight, Beverly sat alone in her kitchen, the envelope still unopened, the wine glass nearly empty. Across the street, Shaq stood by his window, his silhouette a quiet monument to resilience. Between them stretched a silent, unbridgeable distance, heavy with unspoken fears and unseen histories. Neither moved, but the air between them hummed with the weight of choices, those made and those yet to come. The sun dipped further behind the rows of gabled rooftops, leaving the neighborhood bathed in a faint orange glow. Conversations that had been whispers behind curtains now spilled out onto driveways and over hedges. The air seemed to pulse with the quiet buzz of speculation. As neighbors exchanged sideways glances and half-hearted greetings, Shaquille O'Neal's mansion, usually the subject of admiration and envy, had suddenly become the center of whispered judgment. The incident with the police shifting perceptions with the subtle force of a tide pulling out to sea. Victor Hensley stood on his porch, arms crossed over his chest, his weathered face creased into a thoughtful scowl. He'd spent 30 years as a firefighter in this city, pulling people from burning buildings, calming chaos with a steady hand. He'd seen real danger, real emergencies, and this wasn't one of them. His wife Della stood behind him, peering over his shoulder toward the mansion where Shaq had returned to his sunbathing as though nothing had happened. "I don't like it," she murmured, her voice low. "Calling the police like that, just because she didn't recognize him. That's not right." Victor grunted in agreement, but said nothing. He knew too well how these stories spread and twisted themselves into new shapes as they passed from one neighbor to another. A few houses down, Clarissa Vaughn pulled her car to a slow stop in front of an aging two-story, with a crooked mailbox. She was a young journalist, sharp-eyed and restless, with a nose for stories others missed. Her editor had assigned her to cover a broader piece on housing discrimination, but she'd been following a trail of anonymous tips that led her to this street. The messages had been cryptic, hints about racial tensions brewing in an affluent neighborhood, the involvement of a high-profile figure, something the public would eat up. She didn't yet know who lived in the mansion, but her curiosity was piqued. She reached for her notebook, jotting down a few quick observations about the scene. Expensive cars in the driveways, carefully trimmed lawns, and that massive white-columned estate across the street, looming like a monument to old money. Victor noticed her, and narrowed his eyes. Strangers with notebooks didn't just show up here without a reason. He stepped down from his porch and crossed the street to get a better look, his gait slow but deliberate. Clarissa noticed his approach and quickly tucked her pen behind her ear, flashing a polite but guarded smile. "Evening," she said, her tone friendly but non-committal. Victor stopped a few feet away, his arms still folded. "Evening. Can I help you with something?" "Just doing a little research," Clarissa replied smoothly, her voice carrying just enough professionalism to sound convincing. "Looking into some stories about housing issues in the area." Victor grunted, his gaze sweeping over her car, the notepad in her hand, and finally the mansion behind her. "Well, you won't find much of that around here," he said, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Meanwhile, in kitchens and living rooms all along the street, the incident was dissected and reshaped. Mrs. Hallstrom, the elderly woman who lived 3 houses down from Shaq, relayed her version to her sister over the phone, her voice hushed but tinged with excitement. "It was him, that basketball player Shaq or whatever his name is just sitting there like he owned the place. And he does, apparently. The police came and everything. Can you believe it?" Her sister gasped on the other end, the details becoming more embellished with each retelling. Rumors spiraled outward, twisting into distorted versions of the truth, until some neighbors whispered that Shaq had been involved in a dispute with the police, while others speculated that the mansion itself was at the center of some scandal involving property taxes or celebrity drama. Clarissa caught wind of these whispers as she lingered on the street, pretending to take photos of the neighborhood for her supposed research. One neighbor, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair named Leonard Graham, leaned over his fence and offered her a conspiratorial nod. "You didn't hear it from me, but they say there's trouble brewing over there. Something about him not really owning the place. Or maybe taxes. You know how these things go." Clarissa's curiosity sharpened. She jotted down the vague comments, her mind racing with possibilities. Could this be the lead she'd been looking for? She couldn't quite shake the feeling that there was something bigger beneath the surface. A story not just about a misunderstanding, but about power, prejudice, and the quiet fault lines that divided even the most picturesque neighborhoods. Inside his mansion, Shaq remained calm, though he could sense the undercurrent of speculation rippling through the neighborhood, like a slow, poisonous fog. He stood by the large window in his study, gazing out over the lawns as the shadows lengthened. His thoughts drifted to his mother, Lucille, and her warnings about envy and judgment. She had told him that people would always talk, always look for reasons to tear down what they didn't understand. The key, she'd said, was to stay grounded, to remember who you are no matter how loud the whispers became. Victor returned to his porch, his mind troubled. He didn't like the idea of the neighborhood turning against one of its own, or anyone, for that matter, on the flimsiest of reasons. He had grown up in a different era, one where neighbors knew each other's names and watched each other's backs. But even then, he had seen how fear could twist perception. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something about this situation felt off, like there were pieces missing from the puzzle. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, the streetlights flickered on, casting long pools of yellow light across the asphalt. Clarissa sat in her car, flipping through her notes, her mind already forming the skeleton of an article. She didn't have all the facts yet, but the anonymous tip, the neighborhood's quiet panic, and the involvement of a public figure like Shaq gave her enough to keep digging. She made a mental note to return the next day, perhaps with a photographer in tow, and maybe a few pointed questions for the mansion's owner. Unbeknownst to her, the tip that had drawn her here had come from someone within the neighborhood, someone who wanted the story to come out, though their motives remained hidden. The tension that hung over the quiet streets wasn't just about a misunderstanding, it was the beginning of a slow unraveling, threads pulling loose from the fabric of a community too tightly wound by appearances and unspoken fears. Inside his home, Shaq closed the curtains against the growing night, the weight of the day pressing down on his shoulders. He wasn't angry, not yet, but he was alert, aware of the shifting glances, the whispered words, and the stirrings of something deeper than a simple neighborly dispute. He knew that the real storm was still building, quiet and unseen, like a fault line waiting to crack. The sky, once painted in calm pastels, darkened into a restless tapestry of grays. Clouds gathered with an ominous determination, their low rumble echoing the unease seeping into the neighborhood. A sharp breeze tugged at the leaves, carrying the scent of rain on its heels, as though nature itself mirrored the emotional storm coiling beneath the surface of neatly trimmed lawns and whitewashed fences. Inside his home, Shaquille O'Neal stood by the broad living room window, the faint thud of raindrops tapping against the glass like insistent fingers. His mind wasn't on the gathering storm outside, but on the storm brewing within the community. The call to the police, the subtle shift in the way neighbors glanced his way, and the whispers that had reached him through thinly veiled comments, all pressed down on him with a weight he couldn't ignore. He'd seen this before in locker rooms, on the streets, in boardrooms, how one incident could snowball into a narrative, not built on truth but on assumptions and fears. He picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts, until he found the familiar name, Darnell Cooper. Darnell had been his friend since their high school days, a steady presence with a sharp mind and an unflinching moral compass. When Darnell answered, his voice was warm, laced with the familiarity of years spent watching each other's backs. "Darnell, you got a minute?" Shaq's voice was steady, but the underlying tension was unmistakable. "For you? Always," Darnell replied. Shaq explained the events of the past 2 days, the call to the police, the subtle shift in the neighborhood's demeanor, and the realization that his presence had sparked something deeper than a simple misunderstanding. He spoke of the glances, the whispers, and the uneasy feeling settling over his home. Darnell listened in silence, his breathing steady on the line. "You could make a big statement," he said finally, his voice low. "But maybe it's not about statements. Maybe it's about showing them who you are. Not telling them. Do something they don't expect. Open your door, show them your heart." Shaq's brow furrowed as he leaned against the window frame. "Like a community cookout?" "Exactly," Darnell said. "Invite them in. Break bread. Make it impossible for them to see you as anything but a neighbor, a friend. You've got the space, the resources. Use them. Show them grace." The idea settled in Shaq's mind, a seed of possibility pushing through the soil of frustration and weariness. He imagined the community gathered in his backyard, sharing food, stories, laughter. He imagined breaking the narrative, not with confrontation, but with connection. It was bold, it was unexpected, and it was exactly what his mother would have done. Across the street, Beverly Cartwright sat rigidly at her kitchen table, the storm's first drops tapping against her window pane. The unopened eviction notice lay in front of her like a silent threat, its neatly folded contents a stark contrast to the chaos churning in her mind. The letter's words were clinical and final, confirming what she had feared for months. Her late husband's debts, compounded by mounting taxes and missed payments, had finally caught up to her. Her hands trembled as she reached for the envelope, her breath hitching as though the very air had thickened around her. She wanted to tear it up, to pretend it wasn't real, but the weight of reality pressed down on her like the gathering storm clouds above. The fear that had driven her to call the police now morphed into something more primal, desperation. The mansion across the street had become a symbol in her mind, not just of wealth but of her own failures. Seeing Shaq there relaxed and at ease had felt like a slap in the face, a reminder of everything she was about to lose. She thought of the cookouts she used to host with Leonard, the neighbors who used to laugh with her under the glow of string lights, the life she had so carefully constructed now crumbling to dust. She imagined the neighborhood gossip, the judgment that would follow once news of her eviction became public. Pride and fear warred within her, each trying to drown out the other, leaving her paralyzed. The storm outside intensified, rain pattering harder against the glass, a distant roll of thunder rumbling through the air. Inside his home, Shaq's mind was set. He would host the cookout, not as a spectacle but as a gesture of peace and unity. He would show the neighborhood that he wasn't a threat, wasn't an outsider, but a man who believed in community, in connection, He could almost hear his mother's voice in his head, her laughter cutting through the tension, like a blade of light. "Feed them, son. Feed them and they'll see." The storm's first heavy drops began to fall in earnest, the sound filling the house with a steady rhythm that echoed the beat of Shaq's resolve. He made a list in his head: food, invitations, music. He would call Darnell to help with the logistics, maybe reach out to a few trusted vendors. It wasn't about extravagance, it was about sincerity, about opening his doors and letting the community in, forcing them to confront their own assumptions through the simplest, most human of acts: sharing a meal. Across the street, Beverly pressed her forehead against the cool glass. The eviction notice crumpled in her fist. The storm outside blurred her view of the mansion, but she could still make out the silhouette of Shaq standing near his window, his posture steady, unbothered by the rain. For a fleeting moment, she felt a pang of something unexpected, envy perhaps, or regret. She couldn't name it, but it twisted inside her like a knot of emotions too tangled to unravel. The storm raged on, its drumming against the rooftops and windows masking the quiet shifts taking place beneath the surface of the neighborhood. Shaq, resolute and grounded, began preparing for a gesture that would turn the tide, while Beverly, isolated and desperate, faced the crumbling of her carefully maintained world. The storm outside was a prelude, a harbinger of change neither of them could fully predict, but both would have to face. The storm that had blanketed the neighborhood in heavy rain lifted by morning, leaving the air crisp with the scent of damp earth and the promise of clearer skies. Shaquille O'Neal stood at the center of his expansive backyard, surveying the space with a quiet, determined gaze. The sun glinted off the wet grass, and a gentle breeze tugged at the corners of his t-shirt. It was here, in this open space framed by towering oaks and the sweeping lines of his mansion, that he would extend his hand to the community, not with words or apologies, but with food, laughter, and an open door. The idea had taken root overnight, fueled by Darnell's suggestion and his own desire to rise above the tension that had simmered after the call to the police. Now, as he watched his team set up folding tables, arrange platters of food, and string lights between trees, Shaq felt a weight lift from his shoulders. This wasn't about spectacle or showmanship. It was about reclaiming a sense of community, about showing his neighbors, those who whispered, those who judged, that he wasn't a threat but a neighbor like any other. Invitations had been sent out early that morning, hand-delivered by Shaq's assistant, with a smile and a simple message: "Join us this evening for a barbecue at the O'Neal residence. All are welcome. No RSVP required, no formalities, just an open invitation that forced every recipient to confront their assumptions and decide whether to attend." Across the street, Beverly Cartwright sat at her kitchen table, the crumpled eviction notice shoved beneath a stack of unread mail. The invitation lay before her, its simple wording betraying no hint of malice, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it was a trap. Her mind churned with suspicions, fueled by the lingering embarrassment of the police incident. Why would he invite them? Was it a way to humiliate her, to make her feel small in front of the very neighbors whose approval she craved? She imagined stepping into his backyard, surrounded by laughter and easy conversation, only to have him publicly reveal her as the one who had called the police. The thought made her chest tighten, her pulse quicken. She pictured the whispers, the sideways glances, the smug smirks of those who had long suspected her biases. Her pride warred with her fear, each insisting on opposite actions. One demanded she stay home, lock her doors, and pretend she was above the spectacle. The other whispered that attending was the only way to salvage her reputation, to pretend she had nothing to hide. Victor Hensley stood on his porch, the invitation clutched in his broad hand. His wife Della leaned against the doorframe behind him, her brow furrowed in thought. "It's a kind gesture," she said softly. Victor grunted, not quite agreeing, but not ready to dismiss it either. His instincts told him this was Shaq's way of diffusing the tension, of reaching out in peace. Yet a sliver of unease wormed its way into his thoughts. Why now? Why not just let the incident fade into gossip and memory? He found himself curious, almost compelled to attend if only to see what Shaq had in mind. Meanwhile, Clarissa Vaughn sat in her car a few blocks away, reading the anonymous tip on her phone again. The message hinted at something deeper than a misunderstanding, a reckoning of sorts involving a public figure, community bias, and a hidden agenda. When she'd learned that the mansion belonged to Shaquille O'Neal, her curiosity had sharpened into something more focused. Now, with the barbecue invitation in her hand, she saw an opportunity not just for a story but for a deeper exploration of the neighborhood's fragile veneer of unity. She would attend, notebook in hand, ready to observe and, if necessary, expose. As the sun dipped lower, casting a warm golden glow across the neighborhood, cars began pulling into the circular drive of the O'Neal mansion. Neighbors stepped out hesitantly, their conversations hushed as they approached the backyard, where the tables were set, the scent of smoked barbecue filling the air. Shaq stood near the grill, his broad smile welcoming but tinged with an underlying gravity. He greeted each guest with a handshake, a nod or a brief word of thanks for coming. His presence, both commanding and approachable, seemed to disarm some of the initial tension. Beverly lingered at the edge of the crowd, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her gaze flitting from one familiar face to another. She watched as neighbors who had once whispered behind their hands now laughed and clinked glasses, drawn in by the easy charm of Shaq's hospitality. The air hummed with cautious camaraderie, the scent of grilled meat and freshly baked bread mixing with the murmur of tentative conversation. Yet Beverly couldn't shake the feeling that all eyes were on her, even when they weren't. Victor and Della approached her, their expressions unreadable. "Evening, Beverly," Victor said, his tone neutral but edged with something that made her pulse quicken. "Didn't expect to see you here." She forced a tight smile, her voice brittle. "Well, I thought it would be neighborly." Clarissa drifted closer, her notepad discreetly in hand, her eyes sharp as she observed the subtle dynamics at play. She noted Beverly's stiff posture, the wary glances between neighbors, the way Shaq seemed to move through the gathering with a quiet grace that both challenged and soothed the unease in the air. She sensed a deeper story unfolding beneath the surface. A story about fear, pride, and the quiet strength of a man determined to rewrite the narrative others tried to impose on him. As the evening wore on, the tension that had hovered like a thin film over the gathering began to thin, replaced by the rhythmic sounds of clinking glasses, muted laughter, and the comforting sizzle of food on the grill. Shaq's calm presence, his willingness to host and share, slowly diffused the residual mistrust. Yet for Beverly, the knot in her chest remained tight, her thoughts spiraling as she imagined the inevitable moment when her role in the police call would be exposed. But that moment never came. Shaq didn't mention it, didn't so much as hint at the incident. Instead, he moved through the crowd with a quiet dignity, offering food, sharing stories, and reminding everyone through action rather than accusation that community wasn't built on fear but on understanding. By the time dusk settled fully over the neighborhood, string lights casting a soft glow over the gathering, Beverly felt a strange mix of relief and confusion. She had expected retribution, a public shaming, a confrontation that never materialized. Instead, she found herself standing at the edge of a gathering that felt less like a trap and more like an invitation to reconsider, to reconnect, to let go of the assumptions that had driven her actions. As she left the barbecue, her steps slow and uncertain, she glanced back at Shaq, who stood by the grill, his silhouette framed by the soft glow of the lights and the quiet murmur of his guests. For the first time in years, Beverly felt the stirrings of something unfamiliar, a fragile, unsettling sense of humility. The glow from the string lights flickered gently, their golden halos casting warm circles over the gathering. As the barbecue continued into the evening, the voices of neighbors blended with the low hum of crickets, punctuated by soft laughter and the clinking of glassware. But amidst the light and music, Beverly Cartwright felt herself unraveling. Each smile she forced, each polite nod she gave, felt like a layer of armor peeling away to reveal raw nerves beneath. The sight of Shaq moving gracefully between clusters of guests, shaking hands, laughing softly, made her skin prickle with a mixture of resentment and guilt that she couldn't contain much longer. She hovered at the periphery, watching him with an intensity that teetered between curiosity and dread. Her mind replayed the moment the police arrived. Her voice on the phone, the way she'd painted a picture of a threat that had never existed. The neighbors, oblivious to her inner turmoil, carried on, filling their plates with barbecue, chatting about the weather, complimenting Shaq on the spread. But Beverly couldn't shake the sensation that every glance was a silent accusation, that every polite smile masked a deeper judgment. Unable to bear the weight of her own thoughts, she moved toward the grill where Shaq was tending to a new batch of ribs, the scent of smoke and spices enveloping him. Her steps were hesitant, her breath shallow. As she approached, the music seemed to fade into a distant hum. Her heart beat loud in her ears. She stopped a few feet away, her hands clenched at her sides, her voice catching in her throat. "Mr. O'Neal," she said, the words brittle, as though her pride was being ground down with each syllable. Shaq turned toward her, his expression calm, the faint trace of a smile at the corners of his mouth. "Evening, Beverly," he said simply, as if they were old friends greeting each other at any neighborhood gathering. She swallowed hard, her pulse racing. As she hesitated, the confession trembling on her lips. I hope you understand. I didn't mean any harm the other day. Her voice faltered, the words dissolving into silence. Shaq regarded her quietly, his gaze steady but kind. He didn't interrupt, didn't press, simply let the silence stretch between them, until it became clear she wasn't able to finish her thought. He set the tongs down gently on the table beside the grill, and took a small step closer, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I know, Beverly," he said, his tone gentle, laced with something far more profound than pity. "Sometimes fear makes us see things that aren't really there." The words struck her like a blow, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. Her throat tightened, her vision blurred, and she found herself blinking rapidly to keep the rising tide of tears at bay. She tried again, but her voice cracked, betraying her. Shaq's presence was steady, his broad shoulders a silent promise of strength, his expression one of quiet understanding. "It's not about what happened," he said softly. "It's about what we choose to do now." Her defenses crumbled. The weight of her secrets, of the carefully constructed facade she'd maintained for years, collapsed inward. The shame of her actions, the fear of her crumbling financial world, the guilt of projecting her insecurities onto someone else. It all surged to the surface. With a quiet, shuddering breath, she stepped back, her hands trembling. "My husband left me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the distant music. "He left me with everything. The debts, the house, the mess. I've been drowning ever since. I didn't know what else to do. I panicked. I was afraid of losing everything." The confession, raw and broken, hung in the air between them. Shaq's expression softened, a quiet understanding flickering in his eyes. He could see the pieces now, the desperation behind her call, the fear that had nothing to do with him, and everything to do with her own unraveling life. "I'm sorry," Beverly said, her voice cracking, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I was wrong. About you, about everything. She trailed off, unable to finish, the weight of her remorse pressing down like a physical force. Shaq reached out, placing a large, steady hand on her shoulder, a gesture not of forgiveness, but of quiet support. "We all carry things," he said softly. "Some heavier than others, but you don't have to carry them alone." The simple kindness in his words, the absence of judgment, broke something inside her. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs, her head bowing under the weight of guilt and relief. Yet Shaq didn't move to expose her, didn't raise his voice or draw the attention of the gathering. Instead, he offered her a brief nod, a silent agreement that her confession would remain between them. The music swelled in the background as the evening deepened, neighbors continuing to mingle and laugh, unaware of the quiet moment of reckoning happening at the edge of the party. Beverly straightened slowly, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, her breath unsteady. "I'll leave," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "No," Shaq said, his tone firm but gentle. "Stay, eat, talk, be part of this. That's how we move forward." Her gaze met his, searching for a sign of insincerity, but finding none. Slowly, almost reluctantly, she nodded. The knot in her chest loosened just a fraction, replaced by something unfamiliar and fragile: hope. As she returned to the gathering, the tension that had once bound her so tightly eased, though her steps remained hesitant. Shaq watched her go, his face thoughtful, the shadows of the setting sun casting long lines across his features. He felt the echo of his mother's voice, reminding him that true strength wasn't just in forgiveness, but in offering a hand to those who least expected it. Behind her, the party continued as though nothing had happened, the murmur of conversation blending with the soft clatter of plates and the distant crackle of the grill. Yet beneath the surface, something had shifted, a quiet, almost imperceptible change that marked the beginning of understanding. Clarissa Vaughn's pen tapped lightly against the edge of her notepad as she sat in her car parked just down the street from Shaquille O'Neal's mansion. The soft hum of the engine idling underscored the rhythmic sound, her mind racing through fragments of information gathered over the past days. The cookout had been enlightening, but something gnawed at her instincts. There was more to this story than a misunderstanding fueled by prejudice. The anonymous tips, the guarded glances between neighbors, the unusual silence surrounding the mansion's backstory. All of it felt too calculated, too perfectly timed. Her fingers danced across her phone screen, scrolling through public records, digging deeper into local land ownership data, property sales, and corporate filings. What she uncovered made her breath catch in her throat. Beverly Cartwright's late husband, Leonard, hadn't just been a struggling realtor. His name was linked to a web of LLCs, each layered like a shell around the other, obscuring the trail of ownership but leaving faint traces for a diligent researcher to follow. It was no coincidence that several properties in the surrounding neighborhoods, particularly those where longtime residents had been displaced, were connected to his shadowy real estate dealings. Clarissa's pulse quickened as she pieced together the puzzle. Leonard had been part of a larger scheme to quietly buy up properties at below-market rates, evict long-standing homeowners under the guise of redevelopment, and then sell or lease the parcels to high-paying developers eager to gentrify the area. The Cartwrights' pristine image had shielded them from suspicion, but beneath the surface lay a legacy of quiet displacement, of livelihoods upended without headlines or protests. The realization left Clarissa breathless, her pen slipping from her fingers and clattering softly to the dashboard. Beverly wasn't just a bystander caught in a moment of fear. She was part of a legacy that had eroded the very foundation of the community she now felt slipping away. Her panic, her paranoia, were rooted not only in the fear of a stranger on her street, but in the unspoken knowledge that her late husband's choices had left the neighborhood fractured and fragile. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Clarissa found herself staring at the O'Neal mansion with renewed clarity. Shaq's purchase of the property wasn't just a luxury indulgence or an athlete's retreat. It was a deliberate move, a bulwark against the wave of gentrification that threatened to displace families like the ones Leonard had quietly evicted. Clarissa's notes filled with scribbled thoughts as the implications deepened. Shaq had stepped in to preserve the integrity of the neighborhood, his wealth not wielded as a weapon, but as a shield. Inside the mansion, Shaq stood at the window, his gaze steady as he watched the evening shadows stretch across the lawn. His thoughts lingered on his mother's voice, the quiet wisdom that had shaped his life. Lucille had always told him that strength was best used to lift others, not to dominate. He'd known about Leonard's schemes long before he purchased the mansion. Rumors had swirled about how families were pushed out, about predatory deals masked as redevelopment. When the opportunity came to buy the property, an estate many assumed he bought for its grandeur, Shaq had seen more than columns and manicured lawns. He'd seen a chance to disrupt a cycle, to claim a space that would otherwise be used to displace rather than shelter. Beverly sat at her kitchen table, the remnants of the barbecue lingering in her mind. The weight of her husband's debts and the eviction notice still loomed large, but now her thoughts twisted into something darker. The realization clawed at her chest. Leonard's deals, the sudden wealth, the unexplained cash infusions, they weren't just business missteps. They were part of a system that had quietly stolen homes from people, that had driven neighbors away under the guise of progress. And now, ironically, the very forces her husband had helped set into motion were circling back, threatening her own stability. She pressed her fingers to her temples, her breathing shallow. Had she become the victim of her husband's ambition? The same ambition that had driven her to cling so tightly to appearances, to equate stability with superiority, to see strangers as threats rather than potential allies. Her mind churned with memories, the dinners with developers, the contracts Leonard insisted she never question, the sudden withdrawals of cash when certain deals went awry. Pieces clicked into place with a sickening clarity. Clarissa's car door clicked open softly. As she stepped out, her notebook clutched tightly in her hand. The cool evening air brushed against her skin, sharpening her thoughts. She crossed the street toward the mansion, her steps firm, her resolve crystallizing with each stride. She needed to speak to Shaq, to confirm what she'd uncovered. But even as she approached, She realized that he already knew. His actions spoke louder than any headline she could write. The barbecue wasn't just an act of goodwill. It was a calculated choice to offer unity where division had been sown. Shaq met her at the edge of the driveway, his broad silhouette backlit by the gentle glow of porch lights. His eyes held a quiet knowing as Clarissa stopped before him, her breath catching in her throat. "I know why you're here," he said softly, his voice low and even. Clarissa's grip on her notebook tightened, but she hesitated, sensing the depth behind his words. "You bought this place to stop them," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "To protect the neighborhood." Shaq nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "I couldn't stand by and watch them tear it apart. Families deserve better than that. My mother always said, if you have the power to stop the harm, you have the responsibility to act." Clarissa's throat tightened with a mix of admiration and sadness. She realized the story she'd been chasing wasn't one of scandal or petty neighborly disputes. It was a story of silent heroism, of a man using his influence not for personal gain, but for community preservation. Inside her home, Beverly stood at the window, her gaze fixed on the scene outside. The weight of her realization settled heavily on her chest. Her husband's legacy wasn't just a private shame. It was a public wound, one that had festered quietly, until it now threatened to consume her as well. For the first time in years, she felt the hollow ache of regret, not just for what Leonard had done, but for the ways she had allowed herself to be complicit through silence and pride. Clarissa lowered her notebook, her voice softening. "The world should know the truth," she said, though her tone carried a question more than a statement. Shaq's gaze remained steady, his answer firm but gentle. "Sometimes the truth doesn't need headlines. Sometimes it's enough that the right people know. The rest, that's just noise." As the night deepened and the stars emerged overhead, the neighborhood settled into an uneasy quiet. The revelations of the day, the silent confessions, and the quiet acts of resistance wove together into a tapestry of complexity. A story not just of one man's dignity, but of a community's reckoning with its own shadows. The morning after the revelations unfolded like a quiet tremor through the neighborhood. The sky painted itself in hues of soft gold and pale blue. Birds chirped hesitantly, their songs threading between the branches, as if testing the day's mood. Inside her home, Beverly Cartwright sat at her kitchen table, her hands wrapped tightly around a cooling cup of coffee. The eviction notice lay crumpled on the counter, and the memories of Leonard's dealings clawed at her thoughts with relentless persistence. The shame wasn't just about the past anymore. It was the realization that she had become the embodiment of the very forces she now despised. Her pride, once a shield, now felt brittle and foolish. Every assumption she'd made, every hasty judgment, echoed hollowly in her mind. She thought of Shaq's calm, his quiet refusal to lash out, his generosity at the cookout, despite her actions, the memory of his hand on her shoulder, offering silent support without condemnation, haunted her with both its grace and its weight. It was time to face him. With each step across the street, Beverly's heartbeat thudded against her ribs like a warning. The mansion stood quiet, its clean lines and towering columns exuding the same calm that Shaq had shown through the ordeal. When she rang the bell, the sound echoed in her chest, amplifying her anxiety. Moments later, the door opened, and there he stood, broad-shouldered, steady, with a hint of surprise softening his features. "I owe you an apology," Beverly said before he could speak. Her voice trembled, but she forced the words out, determined to strip away the last layers of pride that had held her hostage for so long. "For everything. For the call. For the assumptions. For judging you without knowing you. I was scared, and I let that fear control me. I'm sorry." Shaq's expression remained calm, but his eyes, so often steady and unreadable, softened. He stepped aside, gesturing for her to come in, and she followed, the weight of the moment anchoring her steps. They sat in the spacious living room, where sunlight streamed through the windows, painting golden patterns on the polished floors. "I'm not perfect either," Shaq said, his voice low and even. "But my mother taught me that forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about choosing peace over pride. You're here now, and that takes courage." Beverly felt her throat tighten, her eyes burning with unshed tears. She nodded, swallowing hard, feeling both exposed and oddly relieved. She realized then that his forgiveness wasn't just a gesture. It was a lifeline, a quiet invitation to let go of the bitterness she'd clung to for so long. Meanwhile, across town, Clarissa Vaughn's article had just gone live. Her words were precise yet poignant, weaving the threads of Shaq's quiet heroism. the neighborhood's simmering tensions, and the unspoken impact of systemic prejudice. Instead of sensationalism, she focused on resilience, on the power of community, and on the necessity of confronting implicit biases. Her narrative painted a vivid portrait of a man who had chosen understanding over confrontation, who had used his influence not for show but to safeguard others. The article rippled through social media, drawing a mix of admiration and introspection from readers. Comments flooded in, many expressing regret for how quickly they jumped to conclusions based on initial reports. Some shared personal stories of similar experiences. Others called for deeper conversations about community and prejudice. What had begun as neighborhood gossip had transformed into a wider reckoning, a narrative that forced readers to confront uncomfortable truths about perception and privilege. That afternoon, Shaq called a community meeting on his front lawn. The sun shone brightly, the sky a canvas of brilliant blue as neighbors gathered, curiosity mingling with lingering unease. Victor and Della Hensley stood near the front, exchanging glances that conveyed cautious optimism. Beverly lingered toward the back, her hands clasped tightly, her breath shallow. Clarissa stood nearby, notebook tucked under her arm, ready to observe but with a newfound respect for the story unfolding. Shaq stepped forward, his presence commanding yet warm. "I know the past few days have been tense," he began, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "I know misunderstandings can divide us, but they can also bring us back together if we're willing to listen and learn." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, meeting Beverly's eyes briefly before continuing. "This isn't just about me or what happened here. It's about the kind of neighborhood we want to be, the kind of community we can build if we choose understanding over judgment, connection over division." The crowd murmured in agreement, the weight of his words settling over them like a warm, steadying hand. "That's why I'm starting a neighborhood initiative," Shaq announced, his tone firm but hopeful. "A fund to help residents facing financial hardship, to make sure no one here feels they have to leave their home because of circumstances beyond their control. It's inspired by my mother, Lucille, who believed that community means lifting each other up when times get hard. I'll be matching contributions to get us started, but this will belong to all of us." A ripple of surprise swept through the crowd, followed by a wave of applause. Faces softened, shoulders eased, and for the first time in days, the atmosphere felt less like a battlefield and more like a gathering of neighbors united by something larger than themselves. Beverly's throat tightened, her vision blurring with tears. She didn't bother to hide. For the first time in years, she felt seen, not for her mistakes, but for her capacity to change. Clarissa scribbled furiously in her notebook, her heart swelling with the realization that this story was not about scandal, but about redemption and hope. Shaq's voice carried one final message. This is our chance to make things right, to create a place where everyone feels safe and valued. Let's not waste it. As the meeting dissolved into quiet conversations and spontaneous embraces, Beverly approached him once more, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you," she said, the words simple but laden with sincerity. Shaq nodded, his smile calm and genuine. "It's not about me," he replied softly. "It's about us." In that moment, the mansion no longer felt like a fortress dividing the community but like a bridge, an invitation to rebuild, not just relationships but trust. And as the sun dipped behind the houses, casting long, warm shadows across the gathering, the neighborhood began to feel for the first time in a long while, like a home. The late afternoon sun poured gold across the landscape, drenching the mansion in warm, honeyed light. The shadows stretched long across the emerald lawn, their fingers softening the sharp lines of columns and hedges, casting the neighborhood in a tranquil glow. The barbecue remnants had been cleared away, leaving only the faint scent of smoked meat and charred wood lingering in the air. On the back terrace, Shaquille O'Neal stood alone, his gaze fixed on the horizon, where the sun dipped lower, the edges of the sky kissed in pink and violet. The neighborhood was quiet, but it was a different kind of silence now, no longer tense and brittle, but reflective, like the hush after a storm. In the distance, laughter floated faintly on the breeze from one of the smaller houses down the street. Neighbors were talking, mingling, their voices weaving together like threads of a tapestry. Shaq could almost imagine the walls between them, those unseen but deeply felt barriers of prejudice and fear, beginning to crumble. It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't perfect, but it was something, a shift, a crack in the armor of suspicion that had once encased this place. His mind drifted, unbidden, to memories of his mother, Lucille. He could hear her voice, soft and sure, reminding him that true strength was measured not by how loudly one fought, but by how deeply one loved. She had always been the quiet force behind his resilience, the compass that kept him steady when others tried to define him by the color of his skin, the breadth of his shoulders, the size of his bank account. She had taught him that dignity was something you carried from within, a truth that couldn't be stripped away by judgment or assumption. Tonight, as the sky melted into a deeper shade of indigo, he felt her presence beside him. He imagined her standing there, arms crossed with a faint knowing smile, watching the neighborhood come alive with cautious reconciliation. He could almost hear her saying, "You gave them a reason to believe again. You gave them a reason to see beyond the surface." Behind him, the soft clatter of a door announced someone's approach. Shaq didn't turn right away. Instead, he listened to the quiet steps as they drew closer. Beverly Cartwright's voice, tentative but stronger than before, broke the silence. "Beautiful evening, isn't it?" He turned slightly, offering her a small nod. "Yeah, it is." They stood side by side, not speaking for a moment, both gazing out at the soft blaze of sunset. The tension that had once hummed like a taut wire between them was gone, replaced by something tentative but real, an acknowledgement of mistakes, a silent pact to do better. Beverly's face, drawn with fatigue but softened by humility, turned toward him. "I'm not sure I'll ever be able to make it right," she said, her voice low. Shaq's smile was faint but genuine. "It's not about making it right all at once. It's about taking the first step, and you already did that." She exhaled, a sound that seemed to carry a weight she hadn't realized she'd been holding. For the first time in years, she felt something akin to hope, fragile as it was. Her gaze returned to the horizon, where the sun was now a sliver of gold sinking into the earth. Down the street, Clarissa Vaughn leaned against her car, her notebook closed and tucked beneath her arm. She watched the mansion in the fading light, feeling the hum of a story that wasn't just about headlines or bylines, but about something deeper, about how a single act of kindness, a refusal to meet anger with anger, could change the shape of a community. She thought of the countless other stories unfolding quietly in neighborhoods just like this one. Stories of prejudice and fear, but also of redemption and understanding. Her pen wouldn't capture all of it, but it would capture enough to remind her readers that change was possible, even in the smallest of gestures. As twilight deepened, neighbors lingered in clusters near the sidewalks, their conversations softer now, no longer driven by suspicion but by curiosity and shared experiences. Children's laughter echoed faintly from a backyard, mingling with the gentle rustle of leaves. Porch lights flickered on one by one, each a quiet beacon against the encroaching night. Shaq stepped away from the terrace railing, his steps slow and measured. He walked down the wide stone steps onto the lawn, his shadow long and stretched across the grass. For a moment, he paused to look back at the mansion, its white facade glowing softly under the deepening sky. He thought of the journey that had brought him here, not just the physical path from his childhood home to this place of wealth, but the emotional journey, the quiet battles fought in the spaces between words, the decisions to stand tall when others tried to make him small. He knew this wasn't the end of the story. Prejudice didn't dissolve overnight, and fear wasn't dispelled with a single gesture. But it was a start, a crack in the foundation of judgment, a door left ajar for empathy to slip through. He thought of his mother again, her words echoing in his mind. "Justice isn't always loud, son. Sometimes it's in the quiet things. The decision to stay, the choice to listen, the willingness to forgive." With a final glance toward the horizon, now painted in deep purples and midnight blues, Shaq turned and made his way back toward the house. Beverly followed a few steps behind, her presence no longer marked by suspicion, but by a quiet determination to change. As the neighborhood settled into the hush of evening, a gentle breeze stirred the air, carrying with it the scent of cut grass, cooling pavement, and the faintest trace of barbecue. The mansion, once a symbol of division, now stood as a testament to resilience and the quiet power of grace. In the lingering light, it no longer loomed as a fortress, but shone as a beacon, a reminder that even in the face of misunderstanding and prejudice, compassion could carve a new path. And as the last sliver of sun dipped below the horizon, the neighborhood, bathed in twilight, felt different. It felt, for the first time in a long while, like a community not just in name, but in spirit. Step into stories that reveal the unseen. Challenge what you thought you knew, and echo long after the last line. When the shadows of assumption fade, what remains is truth, and the journey is just beginning. Your voice, your perspective, Your willingness to see beyond those are the real stories waiting to be told. Are you ready to be part of something bigger than yourself?